The second summit between North Korea and the U.S. is wrapped up in Vietnam. It was a high-stakes meeting that came to an end with no agreement, and the ongoing denuclearization process between Pyongyang and Washington seems to have hit a major snag. Although both sides want to keep the momentum going for dialogue, there's no doubt that progress in achieving denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula will be delayed for now. For an in-depth analysis into what caused the talks to fall through and how things will unfold from here, we're joined in the studio by two experts. And to my right, we have Dr. Jung-yeop, a research fellow at the Sejong Institute. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
And to my left, I have Dr. James Kim, a research fellow at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
So, it came to a close yesterday. Dr. Wu, let me start by asking you, usually when there is a summit like this, we would expect some sort of agreement, whether it be small or big. Would you consider the second North Korea-U.S. summit that didn't produce any agreement was something considered very unprecedented in diplomacy?
Yeah, it's just disappointing that the two countries could not reach an agreement this time, but this is not a normal case. A summit usually happens in between two countries. A summit usually takes place when one country invited the other, but this is the case similar to the U.S. versus Soviet Union in Cold War periods. So in 1986, in October, President Reagan and Gorbachev met in Iceland, but they didn't come with any agreement. So there's a precedent that there's a summit without any agreement. So it's disappointing, but it can happen.
So James, let me ask you, the talks ended without bearing any fruit. Would you say no deal is actually better than a bad deal?
Well, that's assuming that we had a bad deal to begin with. There were some breaking reports that were coming out in the first evening until the early morning of a potential deal that looked like the kind of demand that President Trump was talking about. Dismantlement of the Yongbyon site in exchange for sanctions reduction. So if that was in fact, the pre-drafted deal that was never signed, then indeed it was a bad deal, and it's better that President Trump didn't sign any deal. But we don't know exactly what was on that the pre-drafted agreement. So without knowing that, we're not so sure. But clearly, no deal is better than a bad deal. But the most ideal situation would have been some kind of a deal.
So both sides have given their own remarks following the breakdown in the talks. North Korea and the U.S. have made very contrasting remarks, though President Trump at his press conference said that North Korea had demanded the lifting of all sanctions. But a few hours later, North Korea's Foreign Minister Jung-yeop said that they had been asking for partial sanctions relief, now which the U.S. didn't accept. What would you make of this?
So actually, neither side are wrong. So from the North Korean point of view, what they mention is from the number-wise. So from the 11 sanctions imposed on North Korea, they wanted to lift 5 of them. So it's a partial. But from the U.S. point of view, that those 5 sanctions are all the sanctions actually meaningful to change North Korea's behavior. So those sanctions that the North Korea wanted to lift is Resolution 2270 to the 2397 was imposed on 2017. So before those sanctions, all the sanctions imposed on the individuals or entities directly linked to the WMD programs, and only embargo is about their weapon exports. So there was no real impact on the North Korea's general economy. So President Trump mentioned in a way that content-wise, and Mr. Lee mentioned in number-wise.
So turning to you, James, would you say the remarks by President Trump and Foreign Minister Jung-yeop show that there is a difference between the two sides when it comes to denuclearization steps?
Yeah, we knew that there was a gap here, but the nice thing about this summit, if there's any bright spot that we can point out as a positive, is that two men got to learn a little bit more about each other's bottom line. And President Trump now knows the amount of resolve that Kim Jong-un has about willingness to denuclearize. And Kim Jong-un, on the other side, on the other hand, also got a view into how much the U.S. is willing to make some concessions on the sanctions front. So these two men are now going to have to go back to their respective countries, reassess, regroup, and think about the next steps afterwards. So if you're thinking about this as a long game, this is not a complete loss.
So there were a lot of cards on the table this time. Now, if we turn to the expanded summit itself, something to note was that the U.S. had an extra participant compared to North Korea, and that was National Security Advisor John Bolton. Now, he has been known for his hawkish stance on North Korea, but on the opposite side of the table, the North Korean counterpart where he should have sat was left empty. Do you think Pyongyang intentionally did this?
So we don't know yet whether that was intentional. So last year in Singapore, in front of Mr. John Bolton was Mr. Lee Yong-ho. And another participant at the time was Lee Soo-young, who was in charge of foreign policy in the Communist Party of North Korea. But this time, somehow, Mr. Lee Soo-young was not included in the expanded bilateral. So we don't know why Lee Soo-young was excluded, whether it was intention to isolate Mr. John Bolton in the discussion. But since Mr. John Bolton is the national security advisor to the President Trump, there was no way that U.S. wanted to exclude him in the discussion. So I think there are a lot of things mentioned about Mr. John Bolton and his role in the negotiation with North Korea, but his role should be there as a national security advisor. So maybe his role is too much exaggerated in the rupture this time.
So some say that the breakdown of the Hanoi summit also shows that the top-down negotiations aren't working. What's your view on this, James?
Yeah, I mean, this summit was kind of unique in the sense that we had some working level meetings prior to the summit between Kim Hyok-chol and Steve Biegun. They worked on some low-hanging fruit issues, and where the gaps were very large and needed some, real authority to make these important decisions, especially on matters having to do with denuclearization, was going to be closed top-down by President Trump and Kim Jong-un. If the level of expectations that both men had about the other side were truthful, and it was actually very close to what Kim Jong-un had actually thought from President Trump's point of view, and vice versa from Kim Jong-un's point of view. He had an accurate assessment of what President Trump was willing to concede, then this would have been a very successful summit. But clearly, the expectations were misplaced, and there were some calculation errors. So they're going to have to go back and rethink this now.
So some say another factor is the domestic political issues within the U.S. that could have possibly had an impact on these talks. Now, several major media outlets within the U.S. had actually had extensive coverage over the former Trump lawyer and fixer Michael Cohen and his testimony about the law-breaking of Trump. Now, despite the Hanoi summit ongoing, do you think this had any impact at all?
Most definitely. Hours before President Trump was to meet with Kim Jong-un, he was tweeting about Michael Cohen. And that was the last thing on his mind before he got to his hotel. So I would imagine that this is something that was constantly bothering him throughout the 2 days while he was in Vietnam. He also got questions related to this issue during the press briefing session on the last day. So this is clearly something that bothered him, if not affected him and his thinking about how he was going to approach this summit. It's not exactly clear, though, whether or not this was decisive. But it was interesting that the front page coverage on the New York Times was all about Michael Cohen. And then there was some small coverage on North Korea. The following day, it's all over, and it's all about North Korea now. So it's kind of interesting how the media cycle moves, in the U.S.
So to add some interesting points to what James just mentioned, that President Trump tweeted 7 times since he arrived in Hanoi, and 4 of them are not related to North Korea. So 2 are about Michael Cohen, and 1 is about some senator from Connecticut. So President Trump is trying to mocking him, and 1 is the job increase in Michigan. So his focus is not just in the Hanoi, I guess.
So it was probably at the back of his mind. Even at the press conference, he said that he had watched a bit of the testimony, so obviously he was distracted by the issue. Something to note this time around is the difference between the two sides regarding the time issue as well. Kim Jong-un has stressed that there's not even a minute to lose, while President Trump has continuously said that he's in no rush and this won't be the last meeting. How do you see this?
So I don't know whether when Chairman Kim mentioned the time, whether it's a time for negotiation or whether time for like North Korea's like economy. But I think he might be bothered by the presence of the reporters. So President Trump want Chairman Kim to be in front of the reporters. So even Chairman Kim answered the questions asked by foreign press. So it's a very rare case. So I think that maybe Chairman Kim was not really happy about the situation that he has to answer the questions from the press.
So, James, do you think North Korea appears to want fast progress? I mean, the sanctions must be really hitting the regime hard, but is it to do with the fact that the regime is actually trying to put the focus more on economic development now?
Well, it's very clear that sanctions is an important issue for North Korea. So it was a make or break issue for this summit. But clearly, they're not willing to make the concessions on the denuclearization front. So comparison to their nuclear program, economic sanctions still isn't enough of a good bargain. So it suggests to me that on the issue of their denuclearization, clearly North Korea values their nuclear program more so than sanctions relief at the moment.
So now during Trump's press conference on Thursday, the president said that he raised the issue of a second enrichment facility apart from Yongbyon, to which North Korean delegation was actually surprised that the U.S. knew about it. Washington also said there needs to be more than the dismantlement of the Yongbyon nuclear complex. What do you think this entails? Do you have any idea what he's referring to?
So actually the uranium enrichment price was, it doesn't need to be huge. So the all the Yongbyon place, it looks like we can take a photo from the satellite, but the uranium enrichment is almost impossible because you can hide it very easily underground. So maybe North Korea thought that U.S. would never find it, but I think it might be naive that I think President Trump never really had that kind of conversation with the North Koreans. So I think from his point of view, North Koreans might look surprised, but I think North Koreans probably already knew that U.S. might know the information on the second site of uranium enrichment. So that's the kind of thing that now they have to discuss. So if U.S. is going to ask the declaration of the list of the nuclear facilities, then now they are going to have kind of tic-tac-toe games.
Well, just to add to what Dr. Wu had already said, the intelligence community estimates about 10 facilities. One that was mentioned last year in around the period of the summit in May and towards October, is a site about 5 kilometers southwest of Pyongyang called Cheolima or Gangsang. There's a facility that was identified by David Albright at IISS along with Jeff Lewis in Middlebury Institute. That potentially could be larger than Yongbyon. In fact, the production capacity was estimated to be about 20%, assuming that this was a single floor complex and there weren't any multiple floors or underground facilities, as Dr. Wu mentioned. This is one potential candidate that President Trump could have mentioned, but probably not, because that was already revealed by the media last year. There's probably another site that it must have been something that was surprising enough for Kim Jong-un to react in a surprised manner. So it has to be something that wasn't revealed by the press, and we don't know exactly where these sites are, but it's got to be one of those 10 that people are talking about.
So it seems that President Trump, however, has not completely shuttered the doors to dialogue and has expressed his urge to keep the talks going and sometime possibly in the future sit down with Kim Jong-un again for a third summit. Do you think the latest developments in any way will deteriorate the ties between North Korea and the U.S.?
Maybe they are going to. It's going to take some time for them to reconvene this kind of dialogue between two. However, both President Trump and the North Korean media do not say anything negative toward each other. So it is surprising that after this breakdown of the dialogue yesterday, the North Korean media reported that it was actually productive discussions and they look forward to the next meeting. So I think both sides know that it is in their interest to keep the dialogue between them. So I think there's a hope for the next summit. We don't know yet, however, there's going to be a next summit.
What about you, James? What do you think about their personal relationship? Trump has said he's in love with Kim Jong-un. Do you think no outcome at the Hanoi summit will change this in any way?
Well, as Dr. Wu mentioned, I think the immediate statements coming out from the North Korean media is relatively positive. President Trump has already expressed that he wants another meeting. But we have to remember that it was 8 months between the two summits that we had. So I'm guessing that it's going to be something close to that, meaning that we may be spilling over into election season in 2020. And it's going to get interesting if that's the case. And how much time does the president have to focus on this issue? So we'll have to wait and watch. It might take longer than 8 months.
So while the topic is here, so North Korea's state media has also reported about Chairman Kim Jong-un and President Trump's meeting, saying that they agreed the productive dialogues to resolve the issues raised in the second summit in Hanoi. Now, they also said that it served as an important chance to deepen mutual respect between the two, but there was no mention that there was no agreement that came out of this, and there was no criticism of the U.S. either. What do you make of this?
So from North Korean point of view, that it was very rare case that North Korean media has reported that Kim Jong-un is leaving the country for the summit right away. And even the North Korean newspaper reported that Kim Jong-un is briefed by his staff at the embassy in Hanoi. So maybe the North Korean wanted to show some kind of outcome to their people, but apparently, it's not the case this time. So North Koreans could not say that it's a failure for Chairman Kim. So I think that is one reason why North Korean media is fairly positive this time. And for President Trump, the concerns were raised before the summit that because of the political situation of President Trump, there might be a higher chance than before that President Trump might sign a bad deal. So now President Trump did not sign any deal this time. That it is actually good for those who criticize President Trump. So I think that there are still concerns raised by U.S. media that because of the possibility of discontinuation of the talks between two countries, but still that the experts in Washington, D.C. says that a president might have might make a good choice this time.
So within the U.S., some supporters of Trump have actually welcomed that the fact there was no agreement, but the U.S. media, some U.S. media have called this summit a failure. What's your take on this?
Well, it's failure in the sense that they didn't make any forward progress. It's kind of stuck. But I wouldn't call it a complete failure because, as Dr. Wu said, there's some precedents for this. And this is not an easy problem. So it's going to take a lot of work. And we have to think about this as a long game. And so far, neither leader, it seems, has signaled that they want to back away from this. So overall, I think we got to look at this as in the positive way, and think about the gains in the future and the long games that we could have from this. The question is, exactly how to do this better so that we don't repeat this kind of failure again in the future. And I think the working level meeting between Steve Biegun and Kim Hyok-chul is going to be critical for the next round of negotiations. So I look forward to hearing more positive news coming out of Washington and Pyongyang about this.
So another country that was closely watching the developments in Hanoi was actually, in fact, South Korea. The collapse in Pyongyang-Washington dialogue will no doubt put the brakes on any further progress between the two in terms of economic cooperation. Do you think this will have an impact on President Moon's new vision for a new regime on the Korean Peninsula?
So today, at the Independence Day speech, that President Moon said that he's going to pursue a talk with the United States about Kaesong Industrial Complex and the Kumgangsan tourism. So at this stage, it's almost impossible to initiate any two of those projects with North Korea because of the sanctions imposed on North Korea. So those sanctions that North Korea wanted to lift from 2270 to 2039-7, if those sanctions are lifted, then it's a good sign for South Korea to do with those economic cooperation projects with North Korea. But since it is not lifted, those sanctions are not lifted this time, that it'll take time for South Korea to actually launch those projects with North Korea. So what President Moon mentioned is that he's going to pursue this kind of project regardless of the opposition from the United States, but he said that he's going to try to persuade the United States in that way because he believes that that's in the interest of Korean Peninsula and the stability of the region.
What about you, James? Would you say the breakdown in talks at Hanoi would deal a blow to President Moon Jae-in's plans with North Korea?
If inter-Korean economic cooperation is the centerpiece of that plan, it's going to be an uphill battle for President Moon. So the problem, as I agree 100% with Dr. Wu's assessment of this, that it's sanctions. It's all about sanctions at this point. And the question here is, how is President Moon going to convince President Trump, who wasn't even convinced by his best friend Kim Jong-un, to lift the sanctions when President Trump has got this real strict principle that is guiding him, that without denuclearization, there's not going to be any sanctions relief. That's number one. Number two, it's not just President Trump that President Moon needs to convince. These are UN Security Council resolutions, and last time I checked, there are at least 4 other members on the Security Council that have veto rights over any kind of resolution that comes forward, and that's France and UK. So President Moon needs to not only convince China and Russia, who probably will be on board with South Korea on this, but France and UK, which haven't been as receptive to this idea of sanctions relief without CVID. President Moon needs to either rethink his plan about how to shore up his relationship or redefine that relationship between South Korea and North Korea, or he needs to change his approach to the United States and the alliance management side to try to get more concessions from President Trump on these issues. But it's going to be a really, really tough, it's going to be a tough battle if he decides to fight this fight.
So it seems that there's a heavy burden on President Moon's shoulders. Now, President Trump had a phone conversation on the way back to Washington with President Moon on Thursday evening, where he actually called on Seoul to play an active role to mediate future dialogue between North Korea and the U.S. Now, he's been facilitating the talks so that they don't fall through, even since before the June Singapore summit last year. Now, there's no doubt that South Korea has a much more important role now. What do you think will come on President Moon's part?
So I think it can be both opportunity and risk. It's opportunity because if there's a way that President Moon can persuade Chairman Kim that it's in their interest to denuclearize very fast. So there is a way that President Trump can think that it'd be great. President Moon helped him to successfully negotiate with North Korea. But at the same time, it can be a risk because if North Korea is not moved anyhow by any efforts done by President Moon, then President Trump might think that there's no point that he's going to tell President Moon in this process. So South Korea might be excluded in the talks between United States and North Korea. So I think South Korea should very carefully approach this issue. So we need to take advantage of this kind of things when President Trump actually openly mentioned that he wants President Moon's help this time.
So it seems President Moon will seem to get busy now. What's a relief at this point is that neither side is willing to continue these talks. Now, although it's probably hard to tell at this stage, when do you think the talks could get back on track, and how do you think the process will be brought up?
It really depends on how quickly they regroup and when North Korea will agree to the next working level meetings. That's not clear at the moment. From what I've heard coming out of the media reports this morning was that Kim Jong-un has cut his stay in Vietnam a bit short. He's leaving tomorrow morning instead of late afternoon. And there's likely to be a meeting with Xi Jinping thereafter. It'll be interesting what that meeting reveals, if anything at all, about the next steps that North Korea will take. Will it be in coordination with China, or will they continue to go this bilateral, route with the United States? And the coming months will be, I think, a good test. We had between the last summit and this summit, there was about a 2-month period where North Korea basically closed off from the rest of the world. And they were, we believe, rethinking their position and strategizing about their next move. I expect them to take at least just about that much time getting ready for the next steps thereafter. So it'll be interesting to watch what happens in the coming few months from now.
Okay, but I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. Thank you very much to both of you for your insights today.
Thank you.
Thanks.